that Speaker Jones talked about? Is it a racist piece of legislation?
I think there are components of it that are indeed racist because they use racial animus as a means of targeting the behaviors of certain voters to eliminate their limit their participation in elections.
So you believe that the Georgia legislature made deliberate attempts to suppress the minority vote?
Yes.
Georgia has a no excuse absentee voting provision in that law. As Ms. Jones, I think, has said, certainly in her written statement, Connecticut, Delaware, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and New York do not have any no excuse absentee voting. Are the voting laws in Connecticut, Delaware, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and New York racist?
I would say that they are behind the 8 ball and they need to be improved, and that's why I support the For the People Act voting rights provisions that would expand access to no excuses absentee voting. But as we explained earlier, it is how these behaviors are targeted. The state of Georgia targeted communities that used these resources for the first time to their benefit, and thus, after 15 years of Republican-dominated use of absentee balloting, it suddenly changed its mind about the utility, the processing, the timeliness.
So you do think, excuse me, we only have 5 minutes to ask questions, and so if you would respond to my question. So just to be clear, you think Connecticut, Delaware, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and New York that have more restrictive, no excuse absentee voting, you believe those election laws are racist?
Senator, I'm responding to your question. Your question is—
No, Ms. Adams, you're filibustering. Could you answer yes or no?
I'm not. Sir, I'm not filibustering. I'm stating very specifically. I believe that restrictive voting laws should be addressed by the For the People Act. I believe that the Georgia decision—
So just to be clear, whether they're racist or not, you think they need to be changed because you disagree with them, right?
No, that is not what I've said. Okay. I have said that those laws that were changed in 2021 in response to an increased use by people of color, laws that were put in place by Republicans 15 years ago, and they were perfectly satisfied with the utility of those laws until they were used successfully by people of color. The intent matters, and you think that behind these laws matter in the state of Georgia.
You think voter ID requirements are racist?
No, sir. I've always said that. In fact, I wrote a book about the fact that I support voter identification.
Doesn't that restrict voting? The requirement of a voter ID?
I support voter identification. What I object to is restrictive forms of voter identification that limit who is permitted to use their identifications and that create a narrower and narrower list.
And Georgia gives you can use a free ID or a utility bill or something like that. So you don't believe that the Georgia law restricts voting because of the voter identification requirement?
That is not what I've said, sir. What I said is that the absentee ballot requirement that now adds voter ID in an exceptionally rare usage, because it will now push almost 200,000 voters who do not have access or do not currently have those IDs out of the process.
So voter ID,
people of color,
sometimes it's racist, sometimes it's not racist?
The intent always matters, sir, and that is the point of this conversation. That is the point of the Jim Crow narrative, that Jim Crow did not simply look at the activities, it looked at the intent, it looked at the behaviors, and it targeted behaviors that were disproportionately used by people of color.
Do you know that Gallup says that 69% of black voters support voter ID and 75% of voters overall?
Sir, I'm among those who support voter ID. I've never objected to voter ID. I object to narrowly tailoring and narrowing the permissive ability.
So you agree with voter ID in some circumstances and not in others?
That's not what I've said, sir.
No, you said it based on intent. So voter ID without malintent is okay.
No, sir, that's not what I said.
Well,
Senator, I'm happy to respond to your questions.
Ms. Jones, I have a question for you in my remaining time. Ms. Jones, Connecticut, Delaware, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York don't have any no excuse absentee voting. Georgia decided to permit it. Why the differences between Georgia and these other states?
Thank you, Senator Corbin. Georgia has a long history, particularly since Republicans have been in charge since 2003, of expanding access to voting. Senate Bill 202 does no differently, and the voter ID requirements that are being put in place for absentee voting are no different than the voter ID requirements for in-person or early voting. They are precisely the same.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask one last question of Mr. Gardner? Mr. Gardner, I think you said that there is no early voting in New Hampshire, but you don't believe that impacts turnout. Could you explain that? That seems a little counterintuitive.
Yeah, it certainly is counterintuitive, but it's factual. If you take a look at the charts that I've submitted to the committee, the two important things: New Hampshire has no early voting. We have election day, and it stems back to our Constitution from a long time ago. And the second one is the no-fault absentee. That's unconstitutional in New Hampshire. But the chart is really important. If you look at the chart that I gave, and I'm going to be this very specific with it. I've been Secretary of State during 12 presidential election years. The first 5 presidential elections, the state of Oregon had a turnout higher than New Hampshire in each of those 5. Starting in 1996, after Oregon decided to go to all mail voting, we've had 7 presidential elections. Oregon has had a turnout lower than New Hampshire in all 7 of those presidential elections. That's fact. So I've lived through these years watching results that take place in certain states. And that's why I'm not projecting onto the country what New Hampshire does, because other states are different than New Hampshire. But what I'm saying is, in my state, I've seen over the years what ways to make it easier to vote actually work, and what ways that make it easier to vote do not work. And these charts are factual. It's all factual information. So for 7 presidential elections in a row, ever since Oregon decided to get rid of election day registration at the polls and go to no fault, everyone is mailed a ballot. There are no polling places. They have multiple days to vote, multiple locations where they can cast their ballot. Now, academics say that's the easiest, it's the effortless, but I know what has happened between the 2 states. Secretary of State of Oregon actually tried to convince me back in the early 90s to join with him, because he thought that in 5 years, the whole country would be voting by mail if New Hampshire did it on the East Coast and Oregon did it on the West Coast. So this is factual. And those charts that the committee, I implore you to take a look at those charts. It ranks every state, all 50 states, starting in 1976, where they ranked. Take your own state, take a look at it. Compare one state to another state. Now, it's based on voting age population.
Thank you, Mr. Gardner. Thank you very much. Senator Coons?